Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invite here. So it's at UrbanLogiq, our motto, coincidentally, is we build better communities with data. And it was kind of encouraging when I saw like the survey results that the two, I think, most important, or I think the two priority issues that people had raised for the next 5 years was going to be big data and artificial intelligence, and we're a big data artificial intelligence company. I also like the theme around collaboration, because what UrbanLogiq is we're a data analytics platform for governments predominantly, and we help governments design long-range infrastructure plans and community development plans. But increasingly, a lot of our clients are asking us, can we make this data available to the private sector and to the building companies, real estate development companies in our communities? Because it actually doesn't help anyone when a community evolves in a different way than people have been expecting, and investment goes into areas that lead to dead communities and kind of unsold developments, et cetera. So I'm going to show you a lot of the work we do with governments, but the thing I'm hoping you all keep in mind is, from the point of view as builders of communities, this is the data we have, this is the data the government has, and this is what we're doing with this data. And the next thing that is starting to happen is this data is going to be made available to the private sector. And the issue is going to be how would this impact your decisions? And if you're starting to see the data we're collecting, what types of things would make your lives better and your decisions more confident? So kind of just the backdrop. Like, a lot of people talk about big data, but if you think about it, last year more data was collected than in all of the previous human history combined. And this is only accelerating as the proliferation of Internet of Things accelerates. And so from the point of view of governments or those who are building communities, if you think about just urban mobility, so if you think about mobility, traffic is essentially the circulatory system of communities. So you can learn a lot about communities just based if you can track their movements. So in 2017, governments in the United States alone spent $23 billion just tracking traffic. And that's not including the private sector traffic impact analysis studies that I know you and a lot of your colleagues probably do invest quite a bit on. So if you think of, you go to those intersections, you see those inductive loops, those squares or circles in the intersections, and then pneumatic tubes, those people counting with clickers and clipboards, and increasingly computer vision cameras above intersections. Those are the types of infrastructure that cities are spending $23 billion to monitor their traffic. And yet, probably the single best organization that understands everyone's mobility in great detail is Uber. So if you think about it, Uber has monitored and predicted everyone's traffic to an incredible degree. And yet somehow that data is not in the hands of governments. And if you're looking to do a real estate development and you have to hire someone for $39 an hour to do a traffic impact analysis, fun fact, Google, Uber, Lyft, every single one of those companies, including our companies, knows exactly what you're going to find. And yet, why are you having to spend money to recount this data? And so this was kind of the problem that we were brought in to solve, is that a lot of times the governments were saying, we're spending all this money on data, and yet we know that the private sector has this data. And so UrbanLogiq is essentially a platform where the two are married together, the public and the private sector, and all different levels of governments and all different departments within government. Because I used to be a public servant, so we would collect all kinds of data, and you can imagine the types of data that government has. And if you think of all these different sensors, these are real pictures. My one promise was I promised I wouldn't name which cities you're going to see, but this is essentially the day-to-day life of public servants when they're making multi-billion-dollar, multi-generation decisions. So if you think about when they decide, one of our clients, for example, the last undeveloped piece of land is going to go before council for a development plan, and it's about 20% of the landmass, and they're going to zone it for different, whether it's industrial, residential, commercial, et cetera. And they need to know what the population evolution is going to happen over the next 50 and 100 years. And you can't undo these decisions. Once they're done, this is how the community will look and behave for the next 100 years. And what is really alarming is that because of the fact that they use paper maps, what they did is, what you're seeing here is actually, they put one map from StatsCan on one there, then another map of traffic, then another map of the sewage systems, natural gas, et cetera. And what you don't see is they're actually standing to the side here, and the way they're trying to create a picture of their community is they walk back and forth between these maps. Once they make those decisions and they lay out the zoning requirements, that is going to create opportunities or restrictions on what you can do down the road. And so it's in everyone's best interest that they know what they're doing, and this is essentially what we try to do, is we try to provide everyone what we call a common operating picture so everyone can make the most accurate decisions. I like when you talked about how a lot of the problem is not actually just data, it's understanding the problem. And so one of the things that we decided to do was before just kind of throwing data out there, we tried to understand from the point of view of public servants and decision makers and community planners, why are you struggling with data? Why can't you adopt technology? So a fun fact, for the first 6 months when we started the company, we didn't actually write a single line of code. We actually embedded ourselves in different city halls across Canada, the United States. And it's kind of creepy, but with their permission, what we would actually do is we'd sit behind them with a clipboard. And then we would just, with their permission, when their phones would ring, we'd listen on the phone call and say, who called you? It was a real estate developer. What are they asking for? What database are you accessing? Who are you going to? And what happens with that data? And so what you're seeing here is our internal process where we mapped out essentially the entire decision-making process from the moment a developer would say, hey, we would like to build an 80-unit condo here, all the way through to when the permits were issued for road construction, and trying to understand, which parts here are there really strong data points, and which parts here are people essentially guessing, and which parts here are government saying, well, the private sector, we're going to need to come and convince us. And a lot of times, what's really alarming is the private sector proponent couldn't make the case to government, and for that reason, the project didn't go ahead. On the other hand, when we actually looked at the data available, it was a very strong case. The private sector proponent never had access to the data that it could have proved their case. So this is the types of things where I think increasingly the governments are saying we want to share this data with the building community. I'll give you an example of how this works. So City of Surrey was our first ever client. So they have 2,700 induction loops, 320 computer vision cameras, 36 pneumatic tubes, et cetera. And so we just aggregated it all onto those green lines. What you really need to know is not the sensor type, but this is what traffic looks like. And then we put on top of that zoning. So how does traffic behave in industrial versus commercial versus residential and at different times of day? Then we layer down all 15,000 businesses across Surrey. And so where you put different types of businesses, it attracts a different population. And over time, certain clusters of businesses will actually drive who moves into neighborhoods. And then the creepy things you're seeing there are the bubbles. Using cell phones, we're actually able to show where people are clustering. So even data now suddenly that aren't from the government sources, we can actually say there's not a lot of car traffic here, but there's a lot of people spending a lot of time here. And then we took it a step further and we said, what are their demographics? So what you're seeing here is the South Asian community. You can see how they cluster in the north, southwest, and a little bit in the east. And then what you can do, particularly if you're a developer, you can pick a given location and define a radius. So within 500 meters or 100 meters, what have you, what is the kind of ecosystem, what we call the anatomy of that environment? So what's the demographics, the businesses, the economic behavior, the traffic patterns, et cetera. And if you don't want to do circle, we can also let you do, kind of any particularly uniquely shaped polygon. And so this are the types of things that we provide governments when they're trying to make a decision whether to put a childcare center here or an ice rink here. And the same sort of thing, though, when we were in Guelph, Ontario recently, and there was a private sector developer who was literally trying to make the same decision about whether this should be a detached home neighborhood versus, I think, like a multi-tenant apartment. And it was just, I had to bite my lip because we have non-disclosure agreements with the government, but we had all of his answers. And he was about to make an $80 million investment. And we hated to tell him, but he's about to make a really bad decision. And that's where, increasingly the governments were saying, at what point could we release this data? And, which is another topic I think we'll get into shortly. Another thing, so this is one of our partners, a company called Numina. So this is in New York City, which we have our other location. And so they've trained cameras to identify everything from cars, trucks, buses, pedestrians, strollers, wheelchairs. They can identify that. And so they can count them, but all of that, they can also see their behavior. So it's funny, as you can see where people are jaywalking and what types of day they jaywalk, and only certain types of people jaywalk on these types of things. And increasingly, this is what we did for the city. What was fascinating with New York City is New York asked us immediately turn this over to their real estate development community, because that's where they're looking at everything from the placement of fire exits to, in the event of certain disasters, they need to have certain flow-through rates. So they were saying, how many people actually, we have all these doors, but how many actually use these doors versus these doors? And a lot of those decisions, like if you're thinking, we could have had that data all along. Similar to seeing, oops, sorry. I skipped ahead there. So what you're seeing here, and then beyond that, also more of a kind of like the investment in the executive level decisions. So what you're seeing here is we've isolated Petula Bridge here, and we're tracking cell phones. So who crosses this bridge on an hour-by-hour basis? Where are people coming from and where are people going? So where that could be useful in terms of development, where if it's a commercial development and you're wanting to know, what is our particular clientele? Again, the really frustrating thing is we know a lot of private sector people will do clipboards and they'll survey 300 people and say, well, most of our people say they're coming from Surrey to downtown. And yet we're tracking in real time exactly what percentage that is. Similarly, we can also do this with vehicles. So these are what's called Class 8, so freight trucks. And we're isolating, essentially, what we did here is we identified which warehouses are connected to which factories. And so these are the sorts of decisions, again, where this is particularly interesting, where this was, again, a government where they came to us and they said that a lot of their private sector developers are wanting to shut down their warehouses because warehouses don't generate a lot of tax revenue, jobs, et cetera. And yet, what we found out was warehouses in and of themselves are not that valuable, but all the factories that you do value are very reliant on this one warehouse. And so it enabled a situation where this particular government was able to make the case to council that you should give extremely generous support to warehouses because it's the warehouses that, in fact, enable all the factories. We also did this actually, interestingly, with San Francisco, which is we were able to make the case that laundromats need to be protected because laundromats may not be all that valuable, but all the hotels, if you're familiar with San Francisco, you cannot get a laundromat off the San Francisco island, in time for real-time laundry service. So these are the types of things where if you look at how a community fits together and if you're trying to make a case for a particular development or even the makeup of a particular development, these are the types of things that can arm you to come and make an informed decision and have high confidence that if we invest this capital, we can have a fairly strong sense of what the outcome is going to be. Speaking of that, so this is, for example, where we bring in a lot of the artificial intelligence. So this was something we unveiled last March at the last BC Tech Summit. Our data scientist, Julian, this was fascinating. He did this as an intern, so we kept him after this. But as an intern, fresh out of school, he used our data to predict on a given road segment what the mobility, the traffic was, both speed and volume. So he made a prediction kind of a couple months out, and then the Ministry of Transportation went out and they had people actually count with radar guns and traffic to see what the actual results were. So you can see the lines. You have to closely. That's the speed and volume, and then these were his findings. So there's a little bit of a hiccup. Our understanding was there was a car accident, which was the reason why he was a little bit off in that one thing. But by and large, his predictions were shockingly accurate. And there's a number internally that we don't disclose publicly, but we can predict what traffic will be down to an intersection or down to a given building about 4 days in advance to a extremely high level of confidence. And this is only becoming more and more powerful as we get more and more training data. And again, where this goes is really up to you. We have a lot of theories. Recently, a movie theater in a particular neighborhood that wasn't going ahead finally got the green light from their investors because we were able to show them that if you were to open up a movie theater here on a Friday night, you will attract X number of people, which was above the threshold they needed to justify their case. Julian took it a little bit too far, and then he even had, I can tell you which people will be watching what movies. But we reined him in on that. So just kind of a little bit of background. We're a proud Vancouver company, and what's fascinating here is I think this is also something where we like to make why it's also really exciting on the digital space, why the learning curve is so steep. So typical story, Vancouver company, couldn't raise any money here, so with our we didn't even fly. We didn't have enough money for airfare, so we drove down to Silicon Valley, and in 40 minutes we raised our first round. But the more valuable thing was being exposed to Silicon Valley was actually what opened our eyes to a lot of the new data sources available. And then we are quite proud that within a couple days of that, a couple months of that, we were named one of the top 8 companies in Silicon Valley. We opened up our first office in New York in April. The week we opened up the office, they named us one of New York's top 5 companies. But the exciting thing, though, is that a lot of the technology that is going to lead the future, particularly in the built environment, you don't have to go. You don't have to. wait for other people to develop it. A lot of the best innovations are happening right here in Canada, right here in Vancouver, and not just us. Like it's, I think we're very fortunate that we're in an ecosystem where there are a lot of really talented companies. I think you're going to hear about a couple more later on. So this was the other thing. So we were invited to the White House, World Bank, State Department, Harvard. And the reason why I think this is particularly interesting here is because a lot of the discussions, particularly this was the Obama White House, was that they were already starting to get their heads around the fact that a lot of the new technologies, which I think we're going to talk about at the panel this afternoon, are really going to change the way that cities are built. And the governments are trying to get ahead of it. And I think that's where there's a big opportunity where if you're one of in the building community, there's an opportunity now to get ahead of the curve and actually harness a lot of the disruption that's going to happen, because the disruption is going to happen one way or the other. And I think we'll talk about that on the panel later this afternoon. But if you know and you can get a sense of what's about to happen, the opportunities really are amazing. And that's part of the reason why a lot of our client governments are asking us to make data available to their private sector or real estate community, because they're hoping that if their real estate community has a bit of head start, they will, in a sense, be able to get a leap over their neighborhoods. Yeah, and just a couple things where this is going in the future. A lot of the lessons we're learning. One of the benefits with what I mentioned with kind of digital technology is that you very quickly have to compete globally, so you learn globally. So we are doing a particular couple of projects in the Middle East, which we'll talk about later in the year. But even some of the things that we go to the Middle East, which is fascinating, where they're building entire, like in Saudi Arabia, they're building a $500 billion city from scratch. And so imagine what you could do if you never had to deal with legacy infrastructure. That's a lot of the opportunities we're able to see there. And then we come back here and we realize actually some of those lessons could be applied here. And we're modeling those systems in our software. But I think that's an exciting opportunity we can make available. And I think we want to make available to the local communities. And similarly with Hyperloop. So like, if you think about if you live in Los Angeles, you don't shop in San Francisco because it's a 7-hour drive. But what would happen if suddenly, just overnight, San Francisco is suddenly a 35-minute train ride away, right? San Francisco streets were not designed for 5.5 million people to be dropped there on a Sunday afternoon. And so that was where a lot of the planning people were starting to think about, this is going to change the nature of real estate. And essentially, with Hyperloop, Utah becomes the suburbs of Silicon Valley. And so that changes, again, the real estate picture. So in this thing here, we were actually asked by Hyperloop to come down and model out how how Hyperloop development changes actually real estate prices. They were actually trying to sell Hyperloop as affordable housing. Because if you could spread the distance that someone could travel, then suddenly someone can live in Utah and work in Silicon Valley. And so these are the types of things where I think that these are the disruptions going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. And it's really hard to get your head around it because so much change is going to happen so fast. And probably the proudest picture is it's one of the exciting things about in our space is that you don't have to be big to be good. We have an incredibly talented team that we compete against the biggest companies, the Googles and the IBMs, and consistently we do not lose. And I think that's in large part because one of the things that by being a small company we were forced to do is we were forced to collaborate. We do not have the resources to collect our own data, to do everything for ourselves. So out of sheer necessity, what we ended up doing is we would go to governments or real estate developers, including some here locally, and we're saying, do you have data, or like what questions do you have, and we'll share our data with you if you can share your data with us. And I think that sense of collaboration is how we're able to develop a lot of things, even though we're a small team, about 14 people. Anyway, so I want to kind of end it there. We'll be on a panel later this afternoon, and I think that will be a good opportunity to kind of go into any questions you have, especially with some more of the perspectives of some other companies coming up. But I want to thank you for your time and for your attention. Thank you.